Look, when people ask me how everything fell apart so fast, I tell them it's because Vinny couldn't handle that I needed more than just being his personal assistant who happened to share his bed. I'm Claire, 34, and before this whole nightmare destroyed everything I'd worked for, Vinny and I had what looked like a solid marriage, 8 years together, married for 6, 3 kids who are my entire world. Vinny works in operations. Steady but boring. The kind of guy who thinks bringing me coffee in the morning counts as romance. I handle client accounts. Nothing glamorous. But when they offered me this month-long project overseas, I practically jumped at it because, honestly, the idea of being somewhere else felt like I could finally breathe again. Donald had been my supervisor for 2 years, confident guy in his early 40s, wore these expensive suits that made him look important, the type who commanded attention when he walked into meetings. The first week was all work, cramped conference rooms, and endless presentations. But I started noticing how he'd save me a seat next to him, how he'd compliment my ideas in front of clients. Every night, Vinny would call, talking about his boring day, asking me to remind him about parent-teacher conferences, and I'd sit there thinking about how Donald never made me feel like his secretary. The second week, Donald suggested dinner after a brutal client meeting, just to decompress, and I said yes, because another night of room service alone sounded pathetic. We found this cozy place nearby, nothing fancy, but he ordered wine and started asking real questions. What excited me about work, where I saw myself in 5 years, what I actually wanted out of life. I found myself sharing dreams I'd buried under years of soccer practices and grocery lists, talking about feeling invisible at home, like I was just keeping everyone else's life running while mine stood still. He told me about his marriage, how it had become this business arrangement where they split expenses and coordinated schedules, but hadn't connected in months. That hit me because that's exactly what Vinny and I had become, roommates sharing kids and bills, but not really sharing anything meaningful. When Donald walked me back to the hotel, there was this moment by the elevator where he touched my hand, and I felt this jolt I hadn't experienced since college. I should have said goodnight, but instead I invited him up for a drink. We talked until 3 in the morning, and when he finally got up to leave, he kissed me. Not aggressive, just this questioning kiss that made my knees weak like some stupid romance novel. I kissed him back without thinking. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. After he left, I lay there trying to remember when Vinny had last kissed me like he actually wanted me, not just because it was Saturday night and the kids were finally asleep. Donald knocked on my door the next morning with coffee and pastries, acting professional, but there was this energy between us that made every interaction feel electric. During meetings, I'd catch him looking at me in ways that made my stomach flip, and when our hands touched reaching for documents, neither of us pulled away. That night, when he suggested dinner again, I didn't even pretend to hesitate. This time we talked about everything, childhoods, fears, things we'd given up to become the responsible adults everyone expected. I told him how invisible I felt at home, like I was just supporting everyone else's story while my own needs got pushed aside. He understood in a way that made me feel less crazy for wanting more. When we got back to the hotel, I invited him up again, and this time when he kissed me, I knew exactly what was happening. We didn't sleep together that night, but we came close, and the anticipation was driving me insane in the best way. I'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone so badly. It physically hurt to have someone look at you like they were starving. Donald started texting me throughout the day, not work stuff, but little observations, photos that reminded him of our conversations. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, heart racing every time his name appeared. Meanwhile, Vinny's nightly calls became obligations. He'd drone on about his day in excruciating detail, ask the same boring questions, then hand the phone to the kids who chattered about school drama that seemed trivial compared to what I was experiencing. I felt guilty being distracted, but also angry that he was so comfortable with our routine he couldn't sense I was different. The third night, Donald and I didn't pretend dinner was professional. We went to this wine bar tucked in a basement, dimly lit with candles everywhere, spending hours talking and laughing like we'd known each other forever. He said I was brilliant, that working with me reminded him why he'd gotten into this business. When I mentioned Vinny never listened when I talked about work, Donald looked shocked and said any man who didn't hang on my every word was an idiot. By the time we made it back, we were drunk on wine and possibility. In the elevator, he pressed me against the wall and kissed me like his life depended on it, and I kissed back with 8 years of pent-up frustration. When the doors opened, I took his hand and led him to my room without saying a word. That night changed everything. Donald wasn't just physically different from Vinny, he was attentive in ways that made me realize how much I'd been settling for. He took his time, paid attention to what I liked, made me feel like my pleasure mattered. Afterward, we lay talking until sunrise, and I felt more connected to him in one night than I had to Vinny in years. The next 2 weeks became this intoxicating pattern, perfect professionalism during the day, constant electricity underneath. Every shared glance, every accidental touch felt loaded. After work, we'd find new restaurants, new places to be together without pretending we were just colleagues. Every night, he'd come to my room, and we'd lose ourselves in each other. I did things with Donald I'd never done with Vinny, things Vinny had asked for over the years that I'd always avoided. With Donald, everything felt natural, exciting, like I was finally expressing parts of myself that had been locked away. He made me feel adventurous, desirable, fascinating, instead of just a wife and mother going through motions. I stopped feeling guilty about Vinny's calls. I actually started resenting them because they interrupted what Donald and I had created. When Vinny would drone on or ask me to remind him about household tasks, I'd roll my eyes thinking about how Donald never made me feel like his assistant. Sometimes I'd cut calls short, claiming exhaustion just to spend more time with Donald. The lying became easy. I got good at it, telling Vinny about boring colleague dinners when I'd actually been in Donald's arms, describing tedious conference sessions when I'd spent afternoons exploring the city with someone who made me laugh until my sides hurt. I convinced myself what Vinny didn't know couldn't hurt him, that I deserved this happiness after years of feeling taken for granted. The last night, Donald and I didn't sleep at all. We made love with desperate intensity, knowing it might be the last time. Afterward, holding each other, talking about what would happen back home, he said he'd never felt this way about anyone, that I'd shown him what he'd been missing. Part of me wanted to believe we could find a way to be together. But the rational part knew we both had lives, families, responsibilities waiting. When I got Vinny's text saying he and the kids would pick me up at the airport, complete with those stupid kiss emojis, I felt reality crushing back down. Donald was on the same flight, but we sat apart, barely acknowledging each other, and I spent 8 hours staring out the window, trying to figure out how to pretend to be the same person. Seeing Vinny and the kids at baggage claim was like stepping into a life that no longer fit. Vinny hugged me like he actually missed me. The kids were excited to share everything that happened while I was gone, but I felt disconnected, like I was watching someone else's family reunion. During the drive home, Vinny kept asking about the trip while I gave sanitized versions of the truth, thinking about Donald's hands on my body just hours before. That first week back was torture. I threw myself into being perfect wife and mother, elaborate dinners and fun activities with the kids, trying to convince myself this life was enough. But everything felt different now that I knew what I was missing. When Vinny would try to initiate sex, I'd make excuses because being with him after Donald felt like betrayal, not of Vinny, but of myself and what I'd discovered I could feel. Donald texted constantly those first days, saying he missed me, couldn't stop thinking about our time together. I knew I should ignore the messages, but instead found myself sneaking into bathrooms to respond, heart racing like a teenager hiding from parents. When he said he couldn't imagine going back to his old life after what we'd shared, I felt the same way, but didn't know what to do about it. I became hyper-aware of everything wrong with my marriage, how Vinny would grunt responses without looking up from his phone, how he'd assume I'd handle household management without asking if I had time, the fact that he never seemed curious about my inner life, never asked what I was thinking or dreaming, just expected me to be content with our routine forever. About 2 weeks after returning, Donald called while Vinny was at work and the kids were at school. Hearing his voice made my whole body respond in ways that scared me. He said he'd been thinking about leaving his wife, that what we had was too important to give up. I wanted to say yes, wanted to run away with him and start over somewhere nobody knew us, but instead told him we had to stop. Ending it just made everything worse. I felt like I was grieving the loss of who I'd been with him, confident, desirable, interesting. With Vinny, I was back to being the responsible one who remembered appointments and school events, making sure everyone else's needs were met while mine withered. I started drinking more wine at dinner just to numb the dissatisfaction eating me alive. The breaking point came a month later. Vinny and I were having our typical logistics conversation: who was picking up which kid, when to schedule car maintenance, and something snapped. I asked if he ever thought about anything besides mundane household details, and he looked at me like I was speaking another language. When I tried explaining I needed more from our relationship, that I felt lonely even in the same room, he shrugged and said I was being dramatic. That night, after Vinny fell asleep watching TV like every night, I went upstairs and called Donald. Told him I'd made a mistake, couldn't stop thinking about him, needed to see him again. He said he'd been hoping I'd change my mind, and we made plans to meet for lunch while Vinny was at work and the kids were at school. Seeing Donald again was like coming back to life. We met at this cafe across town where nobody would recognize us, and the moment he walked in, I remembered exactly why I'd risked everything. We talked for 3 hours, and it felt so natural, so right, like this was where I belonged. We started meeting regularly, lunch dates when schedules allowed, long phone calls when Vinny worked late, stolen moments that made the rest of my life bearable. I told myself we were just talking, maintaining friendship. But I knew I was lying. Every conversation felt like emotional infidelity. Every text was betrayal. And I didn't care because being connected to Donald was the only thing that made me feel human. The physical relationship resumed after 2 weeks of lunch meetings. Donald had gotten a small apartment across town, officially for late work nights. But really, it became our place. I'd tell Vinny I was running errands or meeting friends, instead spending hours in Donald's arms, remembering what it felt like to be completely wanted. I got careless with lies, staying out longer than fake errands should take, paying more attention to my appearance, buying lingerie Vinny never saw, getting my hair done more often. I was walking around with that glow from great sex and feeling desired. And while Vinny never noticed, other people did. My sister commented that I seemed different, happier, but distracted. The guilt was killing me, but not how you'd expect. I felt guilty about lying, but angry that I had to lie, that I couldn't be honest about what I needed without destroying everyone's lives. I started resenting Vinny for being oblivious, for never asking the right questions, for being satisfied with a marriage that felt like a business arrangement. Donald kept pushing for us to leave our spouses and start over together, and part of me wanted that desperately. But every time I looked at my kids, I couldn't imagine breaking their world for my happiness. So I kept living this double life, wife and mother during the day, Donald's lover whenever possible, feeling split but unwilling to give up either side. The breaking point came when our youngest got sick and had to stay home. I'd already planned to meet Donald at the apartment and, instead of canceling, called my mom to babysit so I could run important errands. Lying to my mother while my child was fever sick so I could have sex with another man should have been my wake-up call. But instead, I justified it by telling myself everyone needed me happy and fulfilled. Finally, 3 months after the original trip, I couldn't take the guilt and lying anymore. I'd just spent an afternoon with Donald, and coming home to Vinny making dinner and asking about my day in that distracted way broke something in me. That night after the kids were in bed, I told him I needed to talk about something important. I started by saying I'd been unhappy in our marriage for a long time, felt disconnected and taken for granted. He seemed genuinely surprised, like it never occurred to him I might have feelings about our relationship beyond going through motions. When I told him about Donald, about the affair, about everything I'd been hiding, he just stared like I was a stranger. His reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of yelling or crying or storming out, he got very quiet and asked specific questions about the timeline, what exactly happened, whether I planned to leave him for Donald. When I said I didn't know what I wanted, that I was confused and needed time to figure things out, he nodded and said he needed to think about everything. The next morning, Vinny was gone before I woke up. And when he came home from work, he had demands written on paper. He wanted a detailed timeline of the affair, wanted me to tell Donald's wife, Elena, what happened, wanted access to all my communications, and wanted paternity tests for all 3 kids. The way he presented it, so calm and methodical, scared me more than screaming would have. I tried to negotiate, explain that telling Elena would destroy her marriage and hurt innocent people. But Vinny was unmovable. He said if I wanted any chance of saving our marriage, I had to be completely transparent. The paternity test demand hurt most because our kids obviously looked like him. But when I protested, he said he needed to be sure of everything now that he knew I could lie so convincingly. Writing the timeline was torture. Seeing everything laid out, every lie, every betrayal, every moment I'd chosen Donald over my family, made it impossible to minimize what I'd done. Vinny read it without expression, asked clarifying questions that made me feel like I was being deposed, then told me I had 48 hours to tell Elena or he'd do it himself. Telling Elena was one of the hardest things I've ever done. She listened without interrupting while I explained everything. And when I finished, she stared at me before asking if I understood what I'd destroyed. She told me about the marriage counseling they'd been trying, how hard they'd worked to reconnect, how Donald had been lying to her face for months while she thought they were making progress. Elena was angrier with Donald, but her fury toward him somehow made everything worse. She called him right there in the coffee shop, screaming over the phone about what a pathetic cliché he was. When she hung up, she said she was calling HR at his company and hoped I was prepared for consequences. The professional fallout was swift. Elena filed a formal complaint about Donald having an affair with a subordinate. Since I'd already left for my new job, I wasn't directly affected, but Donald was suspended pending investigation. Apparently, this wasn't his first time being accused of inappropriate relationships with employees, which would have been useful information months earlier. Meanwhile, Vinny systematically went through all my communications, emails, texts, social media, looking for evidence of other lies. He found conversations with Donald I'd forgotten about, photos from our trip that contradicted my original story, restaurant receipts that didn't match my explanations of where I'd been. Every discovery felt like another nail in our marriage's coffin. Vinny would present each piece of evidence calmly, asking for an explanation, and I could see him cataloging every inconsistency, every additional lie. The worst part was he wasn't wrong. I had been lying about so much more than just the affair. The paternity tests confirmed all 3 kids were his, which should have been a relief, but felt like another accusation. When he showed me the results, there was no satisfaction in his voice, just tired sadness that made me feel worse than anger would have. 3 weeks after my confession, Vinny said he'd hired a divorce attorney and was filing papers. He'd found an apartment across town and wanted to move out by month's end. The speed shocked me. I'd expected him to want counseling or separation first, but he said he couldn't trust me enough to work on the marriage. The divorce proceedings were brutal in their efficiency. Vinny had documented everything: the affair, the lies, the financial deception I hadn't realized I was committing by spending marital money on gifts for Donald and hotel rooms. His attorney painted a picture of me as a serial liar and cheater who destroyed the family for a selfish affair. And honestly, the evidence was damning. I tried to get joint custody, but Vinny's documentation worked against me. He had records of times I'd lied about where I was, family events I'd been distracted during, occasions when I'd chosen to be with Donald instead of being present for the children. The judge granted him primary custody, with me getting every other weekend and 1 evening per week. Watching Vinny pack and move out was surreal. This man I'd lived with for 8 years was calmly, methodically erasing himself from our shared space. He took exactly half of everything with mathematical precision, half the dishes, half the books, half the furniture we'd bought together. Donald's marriage imploded even faster. Elena filed for divorce within days of learning about the affair, apparently taking him for everything she could get. His professional reputation was destroyed, fired after the HR investigation found a pattern of inappropriate relationships with subordinates, and word spread quickly through our industry. 8 months after everything came out, I ran into Donald at a grocery store. He looked terrible, stressed, like he'd aged 5 years in 8 months. When he saw me, instead of the warmth and connection we'd once shared, there was just exhaustion and resentment. He blamed me for pushing him to leave Elena, for not being satisfied with keeping our affair secret, for ruining both our lives by insisting on honesty. Standing there in the cereal aisle looking at this man I destroyed my marriage for, I realized how completely I'd misjudged everything. The passionate connection I thought we had was just the thrill of doing something forbidden. The deep understanding was really him telling me what I wanted to hear. And the love was really just two selfish people using each other to avoid dealing with real problems. Meanwhile, Vinny was thriving in ways that made my stomach hurt. He'd started therapy, joined a support group, reconnected with old friends. When he'd drop off the kids after their weekends, he looked healthier, happier, more confident than in years. He'd lost weight, updated his wardrobe, had this energy I'd never seen before. The kids adored their time with him. He'd plan elaborate adventures, teach them new skills, create traditions that didn't include me. When they'd come back, they'd chatter excitedly about everything they'd done, and I could see how much more engaged he was as a father now that he wasn't trying to maintain a marriage with someone who didn't appreciate him. 15 months after the divorce was finalized, I heard through friends that Vinny had started dating someone. Not random hookups or a rebound relationship, but something serious with a woman who shared his interests and values. The friends were careful not to give details, but I could tell they approved of her in a way they'd probably never approved of me. I spent that night scrolling through social media looking for evidence of this new relationship and finally found a photo of them together at some outdoor festival. She wasn't dramatically beautiful or obviously superior to me, just happy. They both looked happy in a comfortable, natural way, like they actually enjoyed each other's company instead of just tolerating each other out of obligation. That's when it hit me what I'd really lost. Not just a husband or a marriage, but the chance to be the woman in that photo, genuinely content, authentically connected, part of a partnership that brought out the best in both people instead of slowly poisoning them. I'd thrown away 8 years and 3 children's stability for a few months of excitement that turned out to be as fake as everything else. Looking back now, everyone was right about me. I was selfish, dishonest, destructive. But sitting here in my small apartment, seeing my kids every other weekend, watching Vinny build a better life without me, I finally understand the real cost. It wasn't just the marriage I destroyed. It was the chance to become the person I could have been if I'd put the same energy into fixing my problems that I'd put into running away from them.